everyone, my name is Ernaline Projo Midalia and we are the Group 8. We're gonna talk about the political globalization of UN Rapporteur and Duterte's war on drugs. First of all, we will define political globalization. Political globalization refers to the national policies that help nations develop and grow together politically, economically, and culturally, as well as the amount of political cooperation that exists between different countries. It is concerned with how leaders of different countries have merged their laws and developed relationships for mutual gain. It has also meant the softening of national state lines in order to lessen friction between states. The NATO, the European Union, and the United Nations are among the organizations that involves in political globalization. They help or assist one another in resolving global problems and conflicts. And an example of this is when the United Nations settled the conflict between the Philippines and China about the West Philippine Sea. United Nations is an international organization which aims the maintenance of international peace and security. Its task is to avoid violence, assisting parties in conflict to make peace, sending peacekeepers, and fostering the circumstances necessary for peace to remain and prosper. Also, its other objective is to develop a healthy and friendly relationship among countries, protects human rights, delivers humanitarian aid, promotes sustainable development, and uphold international law. UN plays an important role in the process of globalization. The globalization, on the other hand, is the expanding of trade, connection, and integration of people, government, and private enterprises throughout the world. One nation engages or interacts with another country by trading or bartering of products, services, money, cultural practices, and technology.
So let's start with the first main topic, the war on drugs pronouncement of Duterte. Since President Rodrigo Duterte took office on 2016, he declared a war against drugs. He wished to continue the doings he did when he was a mayor in Davao City and somehow apply it across the country or to the whole country. Even on the eve of his 2016 election victory, he said, and I quote, "If I make it to the presidential palace, I will do it just what I did as mayor. You drug pushers, hold up men, and do nothings, you better get out because I'll kill you." End of quote. Then he stated on an interview that the war against drugs was a way to finish the problem of the country, and it was done to save the next generation. The war on drugs would refer to the aggressive anti-drug campaign of the Duterte administration in relation to the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002, where it campaigns against the trafficking and use of dangerous drugs and other similar substances. On his first State of the Nation address, he vowed to protect law enforcers doing the duties for the country, and emphasized that the law enforcers had the right to fight back when their lives were in danger. Duterte also directed all law enforcement agencies to destroy seized legal drugs because destroying the recovered prohibited drugs would prevent the recycling and reselling in the illegal drugs market.
Hello, I am Cherilyn de la Peña and I'm going to discuss about the PNP Cellular Memo in 2016, the double barrel. The huge number of killings in President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs has been constantly criticized by both the local and international community. The Philippine anti-drug campaign mobilized the police, local governments, and other state entities in the fight against illegal drugs. While past governments have enacted laws and policies to combat drugs, the Duterte government made the anti-drug campaign a centerpiece of government policy and mobilized state agencies for the campaign in an unprecedented way. The Command Memorandum Cellular No. 16/2016 was issued by then the newly appointed Chief of the Philippines National Police, Chief Superintendent Roland De La Rosa, on July 1, 2016, President Duterte's first day in office. This cellular laid out of the frame for Duterte's anti-drug campaign, Project Double Barrel. The campaign has two prongs, namely Project Tukhang and Project HVT. The cellular also directed all police offices or units, stations to conduct massive and simultaneous operations starting that day. The lower barrel approach was conducted of Project Tukhang in all drug-affected barangays throughout the country in coordination with the local government units or the LGUs, particularly the provincial, city, municipal, Barangay Anti-Drug Abuse Councils or the ADCs, non-government organizations, the NGOs, stakeholders, and other law enforcement agencies. The Project Tukhang is a practical and realistic means of accelerating the drive against illegal drugs in affected barangays. This concept involves the conduct of house-to-house visitation to persuade suspected illegal drug personalities to stop their illegal drug activities. There are 5 stages in the conduct of Project Tukhang, namely collection and validation of information stage, coordination stage, house-to-house visitation stage, processing and documentation stage, and the monitoring and evaluation stage. The collection and validation of information conducted on the first week of the first month of the President's term. All local police offices, units, stations, and anti-illegal drugs units conducted validation to acquire specific information on suspected drug users and pushers in every affected barangays. In coordination stage, it was done with the following government agencies, stakeholders, and non-government organizations prior to the conduct of actual house-to-house visitations to ensure success of the activity. In house-to-house visitation stage, the actual house-to-house visitations of suspected drug personalities was the highlight of Project Tukhang. It was conducted simultaneously nationwide on the first day of the office of the CPNP. In processing and documentation stage, all suspected drugs personalities who was voluntarily surrender are required to fill out a voluntary surrender form. Personalities who voluntarily surrendered had urged to subscribe under oath before a notary public to be assisted by a counsel and witness by parents, guardians, or barangay officials. In monitoring and evaluation stage, when reporters or illegal drug activities persist despite the house-to-house visitation, the chief of the local police unit or stations and anti-illegal drug unit in the area was immediately initiate police action for the legitimate arrest and filing of appropriate criminal charges against persons who are subject of house-to-house visitations. On the other hand, the upper barrel approach would be the conduct of Project HVT by dedicated focus teams from AIDG or the Anti-Illegal Drug Groups, districts of NCRPO, the National Capital Region Police Office, and the PPO's Police Provincial Office. The focus teams was composed of investigators, intelligence, operatives, and tactical personnel from national support units who was detailed to AIDG, while focus teams from PROs, districts of NCRPO, PPOs, and CPOs generated from the regional support units and public safety forces. The Project HVT, or the High Value Target, is a massive and reinvigorated conduct of anti-illegal drugs operations targeting illegal drugs personalities and drug syndicates. This approach was employed at the national, regional, district, provincial, and city levels to avoid overlapping of operational functions.
Okay, so let's proceed now to extrajudicial killings and human violations of war on drugs. So, for the extrajudicial killings, President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs has murdered tens of thousands of people, mostly in impoverished urban areas in 3 years since he took office in June 2016. Extrajudicial executions by police and their operatives have become commonplace, spreading from Metro Manila to other cities and provinces. The drug war's consequences include not only that but also damage to surviving family members' livelihoods, education, and mental health. The United Nations Human Rights Council issued a resolution in July 2019 requesting that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights produce a report on the Philippines' human rights status by June 2020, putting international condemnation on the Philippines. Political activists, environmentalists, community leaders, and journalists continue to be harassed, threatened, and unjustly arrested, and in some cases attacked and killed by state security agents and government-backed paramilitaries. And from July 1 to 2016, July 1, 2016 to June 30, 2018, the Philippine National Police reported killing 5,526 suspects in police operations. However, this figure excludes the thousands of people killed by unidentified gunmen in cases that the police ignore, bringing the total death toll as high as 27,000 according to the domestic human rights group. So imagine, right? So only one case out of thousands has resulted in police personnel being found guilty. Only one. 3 police officers were sentenced to up to 40 years in jail in November 2018 for the murder of Kian De Los Santos, a 17-year-old boy. If you're familiar with this case, the police officers were seen on CCTV bringing the adolescent into a back alley where he was subsequently discovered dead. In September 2019, the police said that 103 officers were facing criminal charges in court for their roles in drug war killings, but that only half of those involved were charged. Imagine. Meanwhile, the government has maintained its red tagging campaign accusing activists of being members of the sympathizers of the Communist New People's Army or the NPA. Such accusations have frequently been followed by deadly attacks over the years. So, for the human rights violation, according to the report by the UN Human Rights Office, human rights abuses in the Philippines have worsened under President Rodrigo Duterte, with police and vigilantes encouraged to use deadly force in the country's drug war. The Philippines' human rights crisis worsened in 2018 as Duterte continued his homicidal war on drugs, despite rising international criticism. In 2020, the Philippines' human rights situation deteriorated. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights presented a highly negative report on the Philippines' human rights situation in June 2020. The UN Human Rights Council issued a resolution in October extending the country's probe for another 2 years, but without launching an international investigation. Threats and attacks against left-wing political activists, environmental activists, community leaders, indigenous peoples leaders, journalists, lawyers, and others have increased. Thousands of extrajudicial executions have been carried out by police and identified gunmen associated with the authorities. In 2021, serious human rights violations in the Philippines remained. The International Criminal Court, or the ICC, agreed on September 15 to launch a formal inquiry to suspected crimes against humanity committed during President Rodrigo Duterte's war drugs between 2016 and 2019. And according to Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, widespread human rights breaches and abuses in the Philippines continue to continue to be committed with impunity across the country. Her report has been sent to United Nations Council on Human Rights.
United Nations Rapporteur's visit. Over 6,000 people have fallen since President Duterte's election. Even before the president was sworn to office, the media began reporting killings of drug suspects or pushers as early as June 2016. In July, local and international communities expressed their criticisms of the continued violation of human rights and due process under the new administration. Agnes Calamard, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary or Arbitrary Executions, and United Nations Special Rapporteur on Right to Health, Denius Puras, have voiced their concerns. Duterte lashed at Calamard and Puras for criticizing the government's war on drugs in August 2016, calling their statements stupid. But the administration began to play a different tune when the president spoke to welcome the chance to prove he was right, saying he would debate with anyone about his effort to prevent the Philippines from becoming a narco state. "Let them come," he said, "and I will show them," holding out his hand as though he were playing with putty. In November 2016, Calamard welcomed the Philippine government's invitation to investigate the alleged cases of extrajudicial killings of drug suspects. Calamard would be joined by Puras on her visit. Government response of the visit. Things turned south the following months as the visit scheduled for the first quarter of 2017 was reportedly cancelled. Again, the typical confusion ensued as Foreign Affairs Secretary Perfecto Yasay and Assistant Secretary Charles Jose both denied the cancellation. And yet, report quoted Yasay as saying the investigation would not push through if the United Nations Special Rapporteurs failed to comply with the conditions of the President. These conditions included a public debate between Calamard and Duterte. The President also wanted to ask Calamard questions and required her to take an oath to confirm the truthfulness of her intentions. Yasay then demanded that Calamard apologize for the arbitrary findings she made, which unfairly damaged the country. The press reported Calamard's response, who argued that the conditions set by the Duterte government are inconsistent with the United Nations protocols. In her response to the supposed cancellation of their visit, Calamard cited two protocols: the Code of Conduct, which defines the standards of ethical behavior and professional conduct that the mandate holders of the United Nations Human Rights Council must observe, and the Terms of Reference, which serves as the guide for the governments in conduct of country visits. Both protocols provide guidelines that must be upheld by United Nations Special Rapporteurs like Calamard and Puras in performing their duties. Complying with the three demands set by Duterte would not only violate United Nations protocols but also undermine the Special Rapporteur's mandate. Given this, Calamard's decision to ask for reconsideration was fair, as it was reasonable. Unfortunately, the coverage failed to emphasize enough the merits of Calamard's explanation of her position, perhaps because reporters themselves were uninformed about the United Nations protocols. The reports carried the administration's spin that the United Nations Special Rapporteurs are just fearful of Duterte's demand and afraid that they would be shown up by the President. Our Department of Foreign Affairs official should have known better. Their position was untenable and revealed the government's concern about being checked by assessment of a United Nations rapporteur. In the same manner, the media should have known better.
For our conclusion, During the United Nations Human Rights Council's 44th session, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, said the policy has created a cycle of impunity or exemption from punishment for those who were killing innocent people and is responsible for systematic violence that has resulted in thousands of extrajudicial killings. Since Duterte launched a nationwide campaign after his election in 2016. Hence, the United Nations' highest human rights body has already condemned the drug war, and human rights organizations have urged for it to be properly investigated and prosecuted.